Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Yom Kippur. I'm Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA in Washington, D.C. Today is September 16th, 2021. This is our September legislative update. September is traditionally budget time in Washington. Technically, the federal budget is supposed to be approved by October 1st. It never is, but they still try. And this year is not an exception. Most of the focus in Washington is on the budget, the various budget bills. And so we will spend some time today talking about those budget fights, what the numbers look like, most of which is good, and where we expect those to go. First, our history. September 16th is the anniversary of the date the Mayflower left Plymouth, England, sailing to Cape Cod and then to what is now Plymouth, Massachusetts, to found the first successful British colony in the New Worlds. That is a picture of the rock on which the Mayflower landed with the Pilgrims, or perhaps just some random rock that was on the shore that somebody carved 1620 in. I actually grew up just 2 towns north of Plymouth, Massachusetts, and every year from 4th grade through 8th grade, we made a trip down to see the rock, and it is precisely as interesting as it looks. So if you have the opportunity to visit Plymouth Rock, I suggest you don't. However, the Mayflower itself, a replica, is there, and that's pretty cool. Today is also the anniversary of the founding of General Motors in 1920. All right, let's get into the budget. So most of the action, most of the excitement is around the budget reconciliation bill. This is the $3.5 trillion bill that the Democrats in Congress are trying to pass, containing all sorts of various things, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, Congress had set itself a deadline of September 17th to get the bill done. It won't be done by then. We never really expected that it would. This is, Congress sets deadlines for itself all the time. They do push Congress to take action, but there's not really any consequence to missing it. However, the House has written, at least, all of the various pieces of it. What happened is the $3.5 trillion was broken up into little bundles, which were given to the various House committees to decide how to spend. All of those House committees have now produced a draft. The House leadership now needs to take all those drafts, produce a bill, which is expected next week, with a vote sometime around the week of the 27th if all goes according to plan, which it may or may not. The Senate has not done that, and they are due to return next week, where they will try to produce their version of the bill. Talking through some of the House sections of the bill, and $3.5 trillion is a humongous amount of money. So we're not going to go through all the details in the bill because we'd be here all day, but I just want to hit some of the highlights to give you a sense of what the House at least is thinking. On energy, the bill allocates $150 billion for clean energy production. Basically what the bill does is say if utilities produce certain percentage of their energy excuse me, through clean energy production, they'll get certain subsidies. And if the utilities fail to meet their criteria, the utilities will be fined for not doing that. So carrot and stick to push the utilities to produce more clean energy. There's an additional $13 billion for electric vehicle charging stations. That's on top of the money in the infrastructure bill, which we'll talk about in a minute, for electric vehicle charging stations. This is another $13 billion on top of that. And then $9 billion to improve resiliency in the electrical grid, all of which is quite good. On research, there's $4.2 billion to NIST for advanced manufacturing and infrastructure facilities construction. $15.6 billion to the Department of Energy for research, infrastructure, and nuclear energy, as well as a few other things. $11 billion to the NSF for STEM research, infrastructure, and scholarships, fellowships, and other student programs, all of which is cool. There's no policy in the NSF section that we care about, just an increase in the budget. And $4.4 billion for NASA for infrastructure and climate research. Interestingly, not for actual space exploration, although there's money in other bills for that. This is just for terrestrial infrastructure, particularly research facilities on Earth, and then climate research and climate projects, climate-related projects. The bill also has $865 million additional dollars for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. This is the new agency that was set up passed last year as part of the NDAA with IEEE-USA support. The CISA coordinates cyber defenses across the federal government, provides help to other government agencies as well to kind of unify the U.S. government's response to cybersecurity and cybercrime. Last provision that I want to talk about in the House bill is on immigration. As we expected, there's a fairly sizable provision in the reconciliation bill focused on expanding immigration, most of which we don't care about. Family and Dreamers, sort of, we'll get to them in a second, and some other pieces of the immigration world. The high skill stuff, however, is very good. It essentially creates an uncapped exemption for EB visas. The way it would work, because these things are never nice and simple and clean, is someone applies or has their company apply for an EB visa. After you apply, the government kind of does a cursory look at your application, make sure it probably will be accepted. Once they determine you'll probably be accepted, you are given what's called a priority date. That's basically the USCIS's guess as to when a visa will be available to you. Usually that's within a year or two, depending on where you're from and what type of visa you're applying for. However, if you're from India, China, kind of the Philippines to a lesser extent, or if there's something peculiar with your application, your priority date could be 5, 10, even 15 years down the line, which creates a problem. What the reconciliation bill says is if you get a priority date that is more than 2 years away, you can pay $5,000 and skip the line, basically. You would be able to get a new EB visa that does not count against the cap and would essentially be able to get your green card, 6 to 15 months, depending on just regular bureaucratic delays. The effect of this will be to take everybody who is about to get in the green card line out of line, freeing up additional visas for other people, and starting to shrink the EB backlog. The bill also recaptures 225,000 unused visas from previous years, going back to 1992. These are green cards which were not issued, typically just because of bureaucratic inertia. The USCIS just couldn't process enough applications in a given year. There's always some that don't end up being used. Well, this bill reaches back into the past to pull them forward to make them available. 225,000 will go a long way to cleaning out the EB backlog. Interestingly, there's a provision in the Dreamer section, or more accurately, there isn't a provision in the Dreamer section that is going to be useful to us. Dreamers, as you know, are individuals that came to this country illegally but did so as a child. And so the Dreamers, the assumption is that they're not to blame for their presence here and thus shouldn't be punished for it. The reconciliation bill creates a bunch of new visas for all of them, basically gives all of the Dreamers legal status. But what's interesting, in the definition of who can apply for one of these Dreamer visas, the program says it's for people who came to the United States as children, but it doesn't say illegally, which means the children of H-1B workers will be eligible for one of these green cards, which is fantastic. As I mentioned a minute ago, it can sometimes take 10 or more years to get a green card if you are on an H-1B, particularly if you're from India, where most of the people waiting are from. Well, H-1B workers are allowed to bring their spouses and children with them, and they're given essentially H-1B status as well. Except that when a child turns 18, they're no longer a child, and so they age out of the H-1B program. We're seeing, because the wait is so long, children that were brought to this country when they were 10, 5, 2 years old, are suddenly being told they have to go back to the country they've barely been in, where they don't know anybody, just because they've turned 18. Those 18-year-olds would be eligible for one of these Dreamer visas. That's not what they're called, they're just visas. But they would be eligible for a green card under this program, which is very good. The effect of all this should be to allow pretty much any international STEM student in the United States to get a green card within a year or so of graduating. It's going to take a year just because of this paperwork and because USCIS isn't very quick. But a year is, of course, better than a decade. And the students can go on OPT status while they wait, creating for the first time a straight line between graduation and green card that does not involve the H-1B visa. The one piece of this equation that we're going to ask the Senate to add to their bill is to make student visas dual intent visas. The effect of that would be to allow students to start their green card application typically a few months before they graduate instead of the day after they graduate. Not a huge deal, but it should speed up the process and allow immigrants to get their green cards a little bit faster. So that's all the House. What's the Senate doing? Well, the Senate is working on it, but they have not drafted their bill yet. In fact, they haven't even set the final budget numbers to say, Judiciary gets this much, Department of Energy gets this much. They haven't done that. They don't technically have to do that, but it does help the process. The deadline for drafting, the deadline the Senate gave for themselves was actually Wednesday, yesterday. But like most congressional deadlines, it wasn't real. The Senate is going to be back in session next week, where they will take this up and they will try to get it done by the end of the month, but there are already signs of trouble. As you may have heard, both Senators Manchin and Sinema have said they will not support a $3.5 trillion bill. However, Senator Sanders and a few other senators have said that $3.5 trillion is a hard floor. And what Senator Sanders has said is that they compromised to drop the bill to only $3.5 trillion, and they're not going to lower it any further. There are also signs that there are at least a couple other senators who are skeptical of the $3.5 trillion number. Now, at the moment, it's not opposition to any particular piece of the $3.5 trillion bill, merely the size of the bill. However, because the Republicans are not going to support this bill and Democrats aren't trying to get the Republicans to support this bill, the Democrats are going to need exactly every Democrat to vote for it. And even then, the vice president is going to have to break the tie, which means any senator that has a problem with the bill can stop it. And right now, at least two senators are saying it's too big, and at least one senator is saying it's too small, and it's hard to reconcile those two positions without somebody not getting their way. In the House, Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy from Florida, a Democrat, has said she won't support a rushed bill. Not entirely sure what that means, except that it does signal that she's prepared to vote against the House bill when it comes up on the floor later this month, if they can get it done in time. There are 9 moderates who have indicated they're skeptical of the bill as well, and if the Democrats lose 3 of them, they lose the vote in the House. The important factor in all of the people that have indicated skepticism of the bill, all the House members that have indicated skepticism, is they're all from vulnerable districts. Congresswoman Murphy is considered one of the more vulnerable Democrats in Congress. She represents a relatively purple district outside of Tampa. And the Republicans have already indicated they're going to target her next year, and a number of political commentators have said she's already in trouble. However, House progressives, like Senator Sanders, have indicated that they think that 3.5 is already too low. They say that they've already compromised from where they wanted to be to agree to a $3.5 trillion bill, and they don't want to go any lower. House leaders have a little tiny bit of leeway because they can lose a couple votes and still pass the bill, but not very much, and certainly not 9. All of this, by the way, highlights the declining political power of congressional leaders. People like to say that if LBJ were Senate Majority Leader as he was in the late 1950s, we wouldn't have any of these problems because LBJ could just twist arms until he could get pretty much anyone to agree to pretty much anything, and he kind of could. But this is not the 1950s. Congress has changed, politics has changed, society has changed in a lot of different ways that dramatically weaken the power of congressional leaders. Senator Schumer simply can't twist Manchin's arm like LBJ could. As a matter of fact, if Senator Schumer tried, it would help Manchin get reelected in West Virginia. Senator Sinema has a rare characteristic that she doesn't seem to care what anybody else in the Senate thinks. She just won re-election. She's got 5 more years, and she's fairly popular in Arizona. So she doesn't actually need anything from Senator Schumer. Additionally, one of the tools that congressional leaders still have to get people in line are committee appointments. You can go to a skeptical legislator and say, hey, Congressman Smith, I know this is a hard vote for you. I know that this is going to be tough, but if you vote for this bill, if you support your party, take one for the team and vote for this, I will guarantee you a seat on the Appropriations Committee next year or next Congress. Reallocate those every year, which is great. And that's a wonderful prize for a legislator to get if your party's in the majority. If your party's in the minority, it's considerably less exciting. Some of the skepticism we're seeing is again reflecting the growing belief in Washington that the Democrats will lose the House next year, possibly also lose the Senate. It's a long way off. Things can change. I think it's probably premature to make those predictions, but people are starting to believe those predictions and they're starting to act accordingly, which is further weakening the power of the congressional leadership. I think the way out of this for the Democrats is a much smaller reconciliation bill, something around $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion. I don't really see the Progressive Caucus saying, no, we'll take nothing if you won't give us $3.5 trillion. I mean, they'll yell and they'll scream, but they'll probably end up supporting it. Because one person says no, and that's the end of the conversation. $1 trillion is still an awful lot of money. And so I suspect at the end of the day, that's where the conversation's actually going to be. And then the question is, what gets cut when we drop from 3.5 to 1 trillion? And that's where the real debate will be. Talk about the infrastructure real quick. House leaders have committed to voting on the infrastructure bill, which, as you recall, has passed the Senate. The House leaders have committed to that vote by September 27th, which is the same day the reconciliation bill is supposed to be done. The expectation when that promise was made was that they could pass the 2 bills together, either as one thing or do 2 votes back to back. But if the reconciliation bill is not ready, and it's looking like it won't be, then they're not going to be able to do that. Progressives in the House have already said that they will not support the infrastructure bill unless it is tied to the reconciliation bill. So we have a problem. The infrastructure bill is broadly popular in Washington, D.C., in both chambers, both parties, and with the American public. But its passage is complicated in ways that there's not a lot we can do about. Again, I expect congressional leaders to work this out, but it could be rather messy and probably won't pass by the end of September. We're probably looking at sometime in October, which is still okay. The other problem congressional leaders have is that there are 2 major priorities that have to get done by October 1st-ish. The first is FY 2022 budget, which is technically supposed to be done by October 1st. And it won't be. They're not going to get it done in time, which means they have to pass a continuing resolution to punt the deadline down the road a little bit. Also, we're about to hit the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling was technically hit last spring, but the Treasury Department can move money around and do some fancy accounting stuff to push off the date when we have to stop paying interest on our national debt. But their ability to do that is limited, and we're getting to that limit. Interestingly, nobody knows when that exactly is, but it's probably within a month, possibly within a couple weeks. And so Congress is going to have to raise the debt ceiling. Republicans have argued that that should be tossed into the reconciliation bill, except that Congress might not be able to pass the reconciliation bill in time, and the Democrats want to keep it separate. They basically don't want to give the Republicans a talking point that part of reconciliation was raising the debt ceiling. So we have 2 issues, the FY 2022 budget and the debt ceiling. Both of these issues are actually fairly simple. The legislative fixes are easy. The actual legislation can be quite short, probably will be, but they're both politically dangerous. It is unlikely that Republicans will be interested in helping the Democrats solve either problem, so the Democrats are going to have to do it themselves. These are complicated votes. Democrats are going to have to get some Republican support to get them passed, but the Republicans aren't eager to help them. So even though these are easy fixes, they're politically complicated, and even easy fixes take time. We have 6 legislative days between here and October 1st. You can call it 8 if you want to count Mondays. If each one of these takes 2 days, that's half the days left. And there are procedures you have to go through to get a bill passed through Congress, even if everybody agrees to it. So you're looking at least probably, if they speed things up and cut some corners, 2 days of legislative time to get these 2 things done. That's a quarter of the time left by the end of the month, and the October 1st date is a pretty easy one, but the debt ceiling is pretty hard. The implications of not passing that are enormous. Congress was really going to have to get its act together to get those done, which detracts from efforts to draft the reconciliation bill, reach a compromise on the reconciliation bill, redraft the reconciliation bill, and get it passed through Congress before the end of the month, which is why I don't think they're going to do it. They may do it in October, but I don't think they're going to do it in September. Speaking of the 2022 budget, one particular piece of it I want to highlight. We've talked about this before. The DOD research budget, the basic research budget, was cut dramatically in President Biden's budget request. It was reduced by 15.5%, which was unusual because all the other research budgets went up, almost all of them by a lot. But DOD's research budget was cut. On the other hand, the president's budget request doesn't actually mean anything because Congress doesn't look at it. But we now have House numbers to look at, and the House numbers are real because this is the House proposal for what the budget will look like. And the House Defense Appropriations Bill cuts 6.1, that's the budget line for basic research in the Department of Defense budget, reduces it by $230 million or 8.7%. 6.2 is reduced by 8.3%, 6.3 by 1.5%, and DARPA, which is also a research institution, reduced by 0.6%. Now we can look at this 2 ways. On the one hand, those are sizable cuts, not DARPA, but the other cuts are fairly substantial, and in an environment of increasing inflation, even a cut of 0.6% ends up taking a bite out of your budget if inflation's running at 5 or 6%. So on the one hand, these are serious cuts. On the other hand, they're less than the president proposed, so we're making progress. IEEE-USA is in the process of sending a letter as part of a coalition to the Department of Defense asking them to fight for these budgets. And we are and will continue to reach out to legislators to remind them of the importance of these budget priorities. Little news on the H-1B front. A judge yesterday shot down the H-1B allocation process that the Trump administration put in a couple years ago. You may recall the Trump administration got rid of the H-1B visa lottery, where visas were just handed out kind of randomly, and instead put in a tiered system to make sure that the H-1Bs that paid the most relative to Americans in that job category were allocated first, and the H-1B jobs that were paid the least got distributed last. A judge has shot that down. Importantly, however, the judge didn't rule on the actual policy. The judge said that the process the Trump administration used to allocate to create the rule was flawed, and thus the rule was invalid. And frankly, that's not much of a surprise. One of the problems the Trump administration had on a number of fronts is they tended to be a little sloppy in their rulemaking. And when you're sloppy in your rulemaking, rules get thrown out. And so this is disappointing, but it is not surprising. It is encouraging that the judge did not say that the rule itself was illegal or unconstitutional, just that the process used to create it was. IEEE-USA supports allocating H-1Bs based on pay and other criteria rather than just randomly distributing them. A few little pieces of other news. An amendment was proposed to the NDAA that would ban TikTok on federal phones and computers. This mirrors a law that passed the Senate last year and legislation that was introduced by Ken Buck from Colorado earlier this year. This is a little bit disturbing. Internal Facebook reports have surfaced just in the last day or so that show that Facebook knew that Instagram use, that is, led to increased anxiety and depression among teenagers. They've known this apparently for quite a long time, and not only didn't do anything about it, but didn't tell anybody about it. This has already been compared to the tobacco industry's denial of the harmful effects of smoking in the 50s and 60s. This is probably not quite as bad, but it's similar, and will likely lead to additional calls to regulate social media. Lastly, there is a White House summit on semiconductors scheduled next week. Semiconductor and computer chip manufacturers will be coming to the White House, probably be done over Zoom, but whatever, to talk about the chip supply chain and ways the United States can strengthen it. This is related to the CHIPS Act, which is in the infrastructure bill, which is, as we've discussed, stalled in the House at the moment, but we expect to see that language soon. Two little IEEE-USA updates. Remind everybody that we do have a weekly legislative update that comes out on Thursdays, the IEEE-USA Smart Brief. It's just a set of articles on technology development and technology policy that you might find interesting. You can sign up for it at IEEEUSA.org. Click on the news and then the email newsletter tab. Additionally, IEEE-USA offers actually a fairly broad roster of webinars and conferences for folks, IEEE members and others, to participate in. Three that I want to just mention quickly, just to give you a sense of what we're up to. There's a webinar actually at 2 o'clock today, so in about half an hour. Pricing your consultant services right and grow. Mitigating societal harms in a social media world is a conference at the end of the month that IEEE-USA participated in. And EVO 2.0, following up the previous two pieces of EVO, EVO 1 and EVO Pro, will be held November 3rd at 1 o'clock, starting at 1 o'clock Eastern. You can see all of these webinars and the many, many more that we offer at IEEEUSA.org/calendar. Our next update will be September 30th. I know what you're thinking. This is just too good to be true. 3 legislative updates in 1 month. I know. I'm excited as well. But by then we should have a better picture of the budget and have a clearer idea if the reconciliation bill is possible, is probable, or if it's in real trouble. As always, if you have any questions about anything that was mentioned here today, please put it in the chat box and I'll rotate it to it in a second. And while you're doing that, I'm Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations, IEEE-USA in Washington, D.C. My phone number is 202-530-8326. My email address is r.t.harrison@ieee.org. Please feel free to reach out anytime IEEE-USA, or IEEE can be of service. And with that, I'm going to unshare my screen. And there we go. Look at questions. Oh, has Mark Kelly of Arizona expressed a position on the reconciliation bill yet? It depends on your interpretation of that. He has, in fact, said some things which have been interpreted by people as skepticism about the reconciliation bill, or at least the size of the bill. But he hasn't, unlike Sinema and Manchin, he has not said, I oppose this, or I won't support it. The thinking is that he's going to have a tough re-election campaign next year. And he was just elected last year to fill a expired term. So he has to run very quickly. He didn't win overwhelmingly last time. So the expectation is he's going to have a tough race. Sinema is making it hard for him because she's taking such a strong position on the bill. And so a lot of people in Washington think Kelly, Tester, Casey, maybe a couple others would prefer if the reconciliation bill didn't come up for a vote. They just don't want to say so because they don't want to make people mad at them. But if it does come up for a vote, it would not be that surprising to see Kelly vote against it. Let's see. Will any Republicans support the reconciliation bill if it is greatly reduced in size? And I have no idea. That is kind of a big question, though. Currently, the Democrats are drafting the reconciliation bill with the expectation that no Republicans will support it. And frankly, a lot of them don't want Republicans to support it because they want to be able to take complete credit for it. But if the big bill fails, the obvious decision would be to say, okay, let's go talk to some of the Republicans. What is Susan Collins? What are some of the other moderates in the Senate? Say, okay, what would you be willing to agree to? What could you tolerate? If we drop this to $1 trillion, we drop some of the really controversial stuff, what would you be willing to do? I don't know if that's going to happen. In previous years, back in the day, that's exactly what would happen. Things are a little testy up there at the moment, so it may or may not. And it's also possible that no matter what the Democrats do, Republicans won't help them on this one. So we just don't know, but I would expect at least those conversations to happen if and when Congress moves to a smaller bill. Why did the House appropriations bill reduce defense 6.1 and 6.3? And that is a good question. There are a number of rumors floating around. A number of Democratic legislators, well, a number might be too strong, 2 or 3, have said that now that we're out of now that we're out of Afghanistan, we should be able to reduce defense spending, and this may be part of that. I think some of this was influenced by the president, because while congressional leaders didn't really use the president's blueprint, they were aware of where the cuts were, and so they looked to that to get started. There are pieces of the Defense Department that have tried to cut these budgets in the past because they want to take the money and put it someplace else. Generally speaking, the Defense Department is more excited about building jets and boats and things than about doing research that isn't directly tied to specific military programs, which 6.1 and 6.2 and to a lesser extent 6.3 are not. And so there's a lot of things. There's a general, the House increased budgets most other places, particularly in the research field. So some legislators may see this not as a cut, but as a transfer of research dollars from the Defense Department to civilian research. But either way, we need to reverse it, and we're going to be working to do that. Will Robinson, my Vice President of Government Relations, pointed out I just published a piece on the Endless Frontier Act, an insight, which I encourage you all to read. And we have 2 links in the chat to our events and our newsletters. Actually, I think they're both 2 events, the conferences and webinars, which have 2 different registration pages. I don't see any other questions today. I'll stall for a second by reminding you I'm Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations. My email address is r.t.harrison@ieee.org. My phone number is 202-530-8326. You certainly should feel welcome to contact me anytime with questions about policy, IEEE, or anything that's going on in Washington, D.C. And with that, I want to thank you all for joining us today. Hope the start to your fall is off to a strong start, and I look forward to talking with you all again on September 30th. Thank you.
I am trying to build a sustainable electronics industry. The things that we have just don't last as long as they used to, but they could. Every time a new gizmo comes out, we take it apart, find out what makes it tick. We need more engineers in the world. Engineers make the world better. They are designing the systems that keep the world working. So that's why I've been involved with IEEE-USA, is I want to see more kids get excited about engineering. We are working with IEEE-USA to create a world where repair is normal again.